Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again so much for joining us today for Design for Inclusion, Ensuring Techquity in All Learning Spaces. Today's webinar is brought to you by NetRef, which is a classroom management tool that helps educators keep students focused on learning and maximize their EdTech investments. All right, so Ken has been waiting patiently for us on screen, and we appreciate that. Ken has worked as an educator for more than 20 years and has spent most of his classroom experience teaching technology at the middle school level. Ken has worked extensively at the policy level with a number of state departments of education, ministries of education, nonprofits, and was appointed to the Education Technology Task Force formed by a previous California State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Ken is the ISTE Digital Equity PLN 2018 Excellence Award winner and also has been named by EdTech Magazine as an influencer to follow. He holds an MA in education with a specialization in educational technology as well as new media design and production. We're really excited to hear from Ken and learn from his experiences, so I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you now.
Emily, thank you very much. And I want to extend a warm thank you to you and the whole NetRef team for the opportunity to spend this time with all of the attendees. It looks like we're well represented geographically. And thank you all for being in attendance here. So to jump right straight into it, the whole idea around what I'm going to share can be encapsulated into these areas as far as what I will discuss. And then, yes, I will pose some questions and ask you all to share them in the chat. Because the whole idea around this is the following: it's technology, equity, and inclusion, which I encapsulated all into one neologism, which is Techquity, which is ultimately the intersectionality between the use of technology and ensuring equitable learning environments. And to define equity for me, it's simply access and opportunity. How are we providing access to all learners, and how are we providing opportunities for all learners to realize their full potential? So the areas to focus on here are going to be our learning environments. What are the key culturally responsive and culturally relevant characteristics? How do we use technology to create those opportunities? And then, of course, the big thing is how to ensure sustainable growth. I think if you work in education long enough, you see there's a whole lot of buzzwords and things that come around and then they kind of disappear. And as you reflect on it, it's like, oh, I remember that. But then what happened? So, no mission, no initiative, nothing aligned with any change, any meaningful change is sustainable unless we really begin to embody it ourselves, and then we do it in ways that we support each other and continue to engage in the growth in those areas. So my first question to all of you, and feel free to share in the chat your responses, is when it comes to learning, whether you're a classroom teacher, a coach, a district administrator, or a school site administrator, when it comes to learning, what experience do you want students to have? What experience do you want learners to have? And feel free to put your words in the chat, please. And we've got positive, real world, engaged, exciting, efficacy, engagement, inspired, safe. Yes, that's another one. Authentic, personal. All of those, these are great. Look at this. And thank you all. See, these are all things that, let me explain something. One, if you'll notice, how many of those things that you all put there can be measured numerically? And then two, I would argue, my contention is if we were to design learning environments and learning experiences that encapsulate everything that you all have shared in that chat, those are going to be a far greater indicator of the outcomes that students have. See, my whole thing is this: there's a direct correlation between a student experience and a student outcome. If I'm in a learning environment, whether it's a classroom, the school, or even worse, my whole school experience, if I am not seen and heard, then what is my overall disposition towards that learning environment, and how does that serve as an indicator of what the outcomes, I may experience as a result of that? I always share with educators that fun does not have to be seen as a negative when it comes to learning. And in fact, my argument is we actually learn more when we're able to have fun. Now, if I were to define fun, what does that look like? Well, one, am I seen and heard? Two, is my learning environment culturally affirming, culturally responsive, culturally relevant? And here's the key, and I'm going to share some of this with you all later. How am I able to connect what I'm learning to my lived experience of my real world environment? And many of you put the whole thing around engagement. My thing about engagement is this: I'm going to be engaged in a learning endeavor when I'm invested in that learning endeavor. You see, a lot of cases with education, this is something that it took me a few years to realize as well. Busy does not equal productive, and productive does not equal learning. The whole idea around, if I look like I'm busy and I accomplish all these tasks, then therefore I've done what's been required of me. But then if you ask, what was your experience? And then what did you learn? That's a completely different thing. And so for me, my whole thing is, how do we ensure that those are our types of learning environments? Now, with that being said, irrelevant to this, all of you put ways, experiences that you want students to have. The big question for me to ask is, how does technology play a critical and necessary role in actualizing and operationalizing what you put in the chat? How do we use tech to ensure that the environments are safe? How do we use it to ensure that they are affirming? How do we use it to ensure that again, for me, that all students are seen and heard? And I'm going to share with you all an example of how I've done that before. And all of that ties into the big overarching theme that is actually a book that I'm writing right now. And the whole idea is learning culture. What is a culture of our learning environments that I can look at and I can say, okay, based on the culture, the cultural characteristics of the learning environment, I can tell, one, that all students are seen and heard, all students are culturally affirmed, it is relevant both in context and in meaning, and I am accounting for ways in which I can differentiate how students engage in the learning, how I assess their learning, and how they connect with the learning. And so, with that being said, the first step is to identify, what does it mean to be a culturally responsive educator? So I'll share with you a couple of things. One, the characteristics of being a culturally responsive educator are the following. There's three main principal pillars of it. One is the following: are you actively and openly validating students' experiences and their values? If you look at many of your learning environments, especially when many of us go back to face, if you were to look at your learning environment, what you put on the walls, what things are highlighted or accentuated or celebrated, are they affirming across all cultural differences in your classroom? Even if you have a classroom where at face value it's homogenous, in other words, all the students look the same, there's still going to be nuance to the cultural differences. So how are you affirming their experiences and their values? That's one principle. The second principle is actively dismantling power dynamics that reward a dominant group. And so, for example, with that, even at my last school, my previous school I worked at, one of the things that was culturally normalized at that school was, for example, all students that were identified as female, their gender identity was female, they were not encouraged to take any of the STEM courses. So you see, the dominant dynamic was, it's only for students whose gender identity, at least that they could tell, was male, not female. So for me, it was, okay, how do I actively dismantle that? By advocating, encouraging, and empowering the students who were underrepresented to not only take the classes, but doing it in a way that was affirming. These classes are for you. You should be taking those. They will give you a new experience. Do not buy into what classes are for you and not for you. So the whole idea here is to disrupt and dismantle any power dynamic that rewards a dominant group. And then the third one is empowerment. The big thing for me, so to answer the question I shared with you all, what experience do I want students to have? Empowerment. That's it. And of course, that comes with a whole lot of things, because ultimately I recognize from my vast experience in the classroom, when a student feels empowered as a learner, they're going to be more invested in their learning. They're going to be able to make direct connections between what they're learning and their lived experience and the local context. And they're going to be in a position to identify learning pathways to where they can essentially come up with responses or solutions to many of the problems posed. And I'll share a story with you all a little bit later on that. I think one of the things for us to recognize as educators, and this is true for me and most of my friends, part of us becoming educators, we were sold on the fact that we are the saviors of our students, that we're there to help those students. They need you. They're there. You're there for them. They can't do it without you. And I actually think that's a very dangerous approach to teaching and learning, and a very dangerous creation of a cultural dynamic in the classroom. We're not the student saviors. Ideally, we are the catalyst for learner empowerment. Okay. And so that ties in with being culture responsive. So, what are some of the conditions or characteristics? So, the first one is that we are socially conscious. Now, the whole idea around socially conscious is the following: it's being able to recognize and identify how are our students connecting with each other. That's the social conscious aspect. So, my question to you all in the chat is, when your students, no matter where you are in the world, because I notice we're represented, like I said, very well geographically, when your students connect in meaningful ways with their peers, how are they doing that? In other words, what are the platforms, for example, that they're using to do that? Feel free to put it in the chat. And look at this. So we have TikTok, slides and docs, Facebook, definitely social media. I would WhatsApp, Hangouts, Jamboard. Look at all those different things. Okay. I actually would argue that they're not using that today's kids are not using Facebook, because the common comment that I get from students back when we were face to face and I could talk to students, they say Facebook is for old folks. So, but ultimately, you all are sharing. Yeah, look at all those different ways that students are connecting. And of course, my big question for us as educators is not so much how do we use those, which you're going to see an example in a moment, but what are the characteristics of those connections and how might we incorporate those into the classroom? So, for example, when you think in terms of like, especially TikTok or Instagram, highly visual, very easy to use. The user interface is very easy to navigate, allows for immediate or instantaneous feedback, whether it's a comment or a like. And even in terms of the videos, like TikTok is one of my favorites. Think about it, and I'm going to show you all something in a moment. How many, I mean, I can tell you all, for me, I've learned a lot from TikTok. And keep in mind, those are videos and they're only 60 seconds long. So, how do we incorporate things like ease of access, highly visual or visual plus audio, immediate feedback, and direct connections? How might we use those types of characteristics? And many of you listed some things that you've done with your students around connecting in the classroom, and that is part of being the socially conscious. Listen, I love to ask students the following question when I go to schools, or back when I went to school: describe school in one word. And you all can probably guess, and feel free to put in the chat, when I ask the students, describe school in one word, you can probably guess what word it is that they use. See, exactly. And so then I always challenge the students. I'm like, but school actually isn't boring. And then they're like, no, Mr. Sheldon, is boring. I'm like, nah. I say, hear me out. I'm gonna sell you on how school isn't boring. You like hanging out with your friends? And then, of course, the answer is usually yes. And keep in mind, this is pre-COVID. So, but you like hanging out with your friends? Yes. How many of you participated in extracurricular activities, sports, arts, anything like that? Hands go up. I'm like, you enjoy doing that as well? Yes. And I'm like, okay, so what you're really saying is the school isn't boring. What you don't like, especially in your learning spaces, is the predictability of things. And what you do like is being able to make meaningful social connections with your classmates. And then, of course, then usually I get the response like, oh, okay, you're right. So the whole idea around that for us is, if you think in terms of our learning environments, how might we incorporate the social dynamic that many of our kids already engage in with their peers within the context of our learning environment? And I'll share with you all an example, but this came up on my social media feed a couple of days ago. And you even look at this. Remember, some of you have mentioned TikTok. Here's one for you. Want to talk about design for inclusion and being culturally responsive? There's one for you. How about, instead of giving students a multiple choice test, you ask students, how many of you have a TikTok account? And how can you represent your knowledge and understanding of what we've done in a TikTok video? And by the way, you have only 60 seconds to do it. Think about how effective you have to be at communicating, how effective you have to be at condensing down my learning to represent it in 60 seconds. But go back to the whole idea around being culturally responsive. For some of us, we might say, oh, I can't do it in 60 seconds. It's not about us. Remember, learner empowerment. If you've got students that are already using it, my big question, how might you use that to represent your learning in class? Go. And then, of course, if you see the results, which I used to do this with my students all the time, if you see results where you're like, wow, that's amazing, share it with your classmates. Now there's more of the connections. And that's more the empowerment. I'm not saying, well, this is the best and all of you need to be like this. What I am saying is I'm empowering that individual learner. Hey, you know what? Now that I've seen this and this is fantastic, how are you going to share that with your classmates so that everyone can do it? You see, the whole idea, that's another thing of equity, is validate, is each individual's contributions uplift or accelerate group learning. And then even continuing on, there was this one. This one is fascinating to me. And some of you even put that in there, Instagram. Look at that. So my question for you all here, what happened that the teacher was getting roughly about 50% attendance using Google Meet, but then said, okay, I'm going to shift to IG Live. And now all of a sudden it's 90 to 100%. So here are some of our design and some of our inclusion questions to ask here. What is the difference between the platforms? How is this teacher being culturally responsive in a way that made class more accessible and to some degree more engaging for the students by simply shifting from Google Meet to Instagram Live? And my argument is the following. One, students they all are going to have their phone with them. They probably are likely to be using the phone. And so therefore, in this context, IG Live is normalized, so then fine, I'll go over to that particular platform. And some of you are putting in the chat, yes, there are concerns for younger learners, and we want to be mindful of FERPA and COPA. But my whole thing is this: if you're knowledgeable about those particular regulations in regards to student privacy, the whole idea here is, what am I doing to connect with my students, and how can I do it in a way that is more engaging, that is obviously safe? And even in some cases, my question, and I don't really have an answer for this, but my question is, would you rather say, I'm not going to take a chance and I'm just going to use Google Meet and just roll the dice and I'll get 50%? Or say, here's a barrier, here's how I can dismantle that barrier and be more engaging with my students, and maybe even use it in a way to say, listen, you all need to understand what Online Privacy Protection Act is, at least here in the United States. You need to understand that. You need to understand what concerns I would have with using this platform. Now, how might we work within the context of that, but to make the learning environment more accessible? And so then even continuing on, the next question, the next characteristic of being culturally responsive is getting to know our students' lives. And more specifically, which I'll talk about that in a moment, is when you view your students, do you view their backgrounds as assets and not liabilities? Unfortunately, there is big business in deficit-based language in education. Instead of saying, okay, I've got students that come from different backgrounds. Those backgrounds can be an asset. How do I create the conditions for students to be able to identify what their strengths are, and then how they might use those strengths in the classroom? A funny side note story I like, or not funny, but a side note story I like to share with this is, for example, at my last school, one of the things that was normalized in school for several years was at the beginning of the year, all the students would do a project of which they would talk about what they did over the summer. And it wasn't until about my fourth year at this school that one of my students came up to me and said, you know what, Mr. Shelton, it's not fair that we have to do that project at the beginning of the school year. And I look at many of my classmates who come from wealthy families, and they get to go on like European vacation or vacation to some exotic tropical area, and I have to work in my family's restaurant. It's not fair that they're the ones that are celebrated and I'm not. And ultimately for me, that was my awareness of, you know what, good point. So for me, I changed that whole thing up. For me, the questions I would ask the students were, what new experiences or skills did you gain over the course of the summer that will help support your learning? And how might you share that with your classmates to support their learning as well? You see, now it's again, designed for inclusion. It's dismantling, in this case, the hierarchy of class or socioeconomic status to say, whatever you had access to based on financial fidelity, if you are financial access, is not as relevant as what did you gain out of that experience, and how might you share that with your classmates to support the entire group. And this is why I always share with folks to be mindful of things like the use of big data. Big data is always true in general, but never in particular. So the numbers might say one thing, but we want to get to quote one of my close friends, Tom Murray, what are the stories behind the data? What are the stories behind the numbers? And how do we support students in recognizing that you come into the learning environment with skills and assets that ideally I can support you in identifying? There's the empowerment piece. And then once you identify those, how might you share those with your classmates to support all of for support group learning? So again, this characteristic is seeing students' backgrounds as assets and not liabilities. And that even ties with this is, are we looking at our diverse student identities as assets and strengths that can advance individual and group learning rather than seeing them as challenges or difficulties to be overcome? And then continuing on, the next one is identification of the moral imperative. And I'll go through all 5 of these again. So my question to all of you is, why are you an educator? That whatever the answer is to that, and then I even add to that, what gets you up in the morning and hopefully what only sometimes might keep you up at night. Whatever the answers are to those questions, that ideally aligns with your moral imperative as an educator. For me as an educator, it was simple. My moral imperative was I wanted students to experience success, because I know that when you experience success, you reflect on it, you identify the strategies or steps that were necessary to be successful. There's a high probability that you're going to duplicate them. It's the same reason why for us as adults, think about it when you want to engage in a modification of a lifestyle, whether it's I need to lose weight, I want to get in shape, I want to learn another language. When you start to reflect on things you did that were successful, you then begin to adopt those as a part of a normalized component to your lifestyle. So for me, with student, again, align with those 3 principles, the empowerment piece. We're going to do things, you're going to reflect on them, you're going to identify what strengths or what steps you took to be successful. And then we're going to ask, how might you use those for the next time we do a project? And then, of course, in some cases with some students, is what resources and support might be helpful for you to make what you identify as success normalized for you. And of course, I'll share this last piece with that. Success should not be indicative of an entire group. It should be individualized. In fact, I'll even ask you all this, and it's something I'm working on a blog posting series with a close friend of mine. The whole idea around grades and grading. I really think we need to do a strong interrogation and examination on grades. So, for example, I will ask you all this. If I'm a student in a class that has a traditional antiquated grading model, which means 0 to 59% is an F, 60 to 69 a D, 70 to 79 C, and so forth, which shows more growth and which would we apply greater value to? A student that would go, if I improve from, let's say, 88% to 91%, or I go from 61% to 88%, which one of those 2 is going to be considered of higher value, especially when you think in terms of the corresponding letter? And so for me, success should be individualized and served as a way for empowerment. That's why I used to always tell my students, look, you know what, when it comes to grading, in fact, to be honest with you, I used to have my students negotiate for their grades. It's in a whole different talk I do. I would say, okay, let's assess where you are. Here's the project we're going to do. These are the proficient measures that I have in place. And then we're going to talk and you're going to identify how did you represent the totality of your learning and the progression of your learning. And then because I have to do a letter, we together will determine what that letter is. But I want you to advocate for yourself as to what you think it is representational of. Again, going back to responsive, that's also learner empowerment, being able to assess where I am as a learner and being able to articulate it to my teacher, in this case, me, what I think that equates to. And then here's another condition around the curriculum that is not only culturally responsive, but think about it in terms of validating students' experiences and their values. And this is where the technology piece comes in, because ultimately, most of standardized curriculums do not give agency to non-dominant populations. And so for us as educators, we have to be intentional in asking ourselves, in the course of learning X unit or X content, what voices are highlighted, what voices have agency, and what voices are missing? Now, how might I use the technology to give access to the voices that are missing and support my students' exposure to, in this case, non-dominant populations from an asset perspective, not from a deficit perspective? And then I'll continue on. Again, the other one I mentioned is getting to know students' lives. My question to all of you, how well do you know your students beyond their correctly pronounced first name and their number? What are students bringing into our learning environments, whether it's face to face or virtual, that we don't know? Going back to that big data, and again, hat tip to my BFF Tom Murray. What are the hidden stories behind that? I'm going to share with you all. Once I started to get to know a lot of the things that my students were tasked with or challenged with in their social context, it really made me a much more responsive educator. For example, I used to have the students do this daily check-in forum. Every day, the students will come into class, and in fact, I'll share with you all two things aligned with this. So one is the following. There is now published peer-reviewed research that supports the action, if you will, of an educator, that when you greet students upon entry to a learning environment, they're over by their correctly pronounced first name, by the way, as well. Let me be clear on that one. Correctly pronounced first name, not what's easy for me. What is the correctly pronounced first name? And in fact, before I explain this, I'm going to share with you all again, going to inclusion. I used to have students do, and I would do it now because some of you mentioned that you use things like Flipgrid. I would actually have students do a project where, what is your name? What is the history behind your name? And then do a quick recording video of how to pronounce your first name. And then now share it with your classmates. And then also with me. You see, now again, someone of you put in a chat, name is the first part of our identity that in some cases, depending upon who we are, we get stripped of. And so the whole point with what you see here is, if I'm greeting you as a learner upon entry to my learning environment by your correctly pronounced first name, one, your overall disposition towards that learning environment is going to be more positive. That goes back to the culture thing. I'm validating you. That goes to being the culture responsive thing. And what you're seeing here on this slide was my daily check-in form. Now, how does that relate to getting in those students' lives? I will tell you all, this gave me a window into the lives of all of my students, because if you are a student of mine, I greeted you as you upon entry to the classroom, and the first 30 seconds of class, actually 90 seconds, you would fill out this form. First and last name. And I don't know if you all can catch the design for inclusion in this. I had many students of which English was not their primary language. So I used the emojis as a way to bridge any potential descriptive language barriers with English. And on a side note, I do want to share with you all that we really need to reject and really interrogate the use of ELL, or English language learner. Now, I know many of you are not based here in the United States, but I will share with you all, I've seen it more than just in the US, is the whole idea around English is on a language hierarchy, English is at the top. And I vehemently reject that, because I can happen to be able to speak more than one language, and there's power and empowerment in being able to speak more than one language. And for many of us, if English isn't our primary language, we are just simply acquiring another language. And so I used to always tell my students that were identified as ELL, I'm like, no, you're not an English language learner. You're a developing multilingual or emerging multilingual. I've heard emerging as well. Because think about the power in being able to effectively communicate in more than one language. And the whole idea around that is we don't want to create a hierarchy with that. So relevant to this is the fact that, one, I have the descriptors and I have the emoji. The emoji serves as that barrier, that bridge between, I know what Mr. Shelton is asking, but I don't have the words, but I can associate it with the visuals. And then if you'll notice on that last question down there, I asked the student, how can I be of more support to you on your needs, both personal and or academic? And I will share with you all, that gave me a clear window into the lived experiences of many of my students. And so, for example, even something as simple as me seeing a student when they walk in first thing in the morning and they're very tired, and then I based on this and then looking at the pattern over time, I know that, for example, many of my students lived in an area near the school where the police helicopter would be circling above their apartment building for anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, 2 to 3 nights a week. So for me to be responsive is to recognize, okay, that is something that child has no control over. So my default response should not be, you need to wake up, you need to wake up. My default response is, if you need to put your head down, let me know. Can I be of any support or to you at all? And even just something as simple as this form and doing that. Remember, I mentioned earlier, seen and heard. All of my students were seen and heard, and it means that their disposition towards me, their trust towards me, and their overall disposition towards the learning environment is going to be very different. And that's why I go back to that first slide you all saw around culture. If you were to ask yourself, what is the culture of that learning environment? That's the following. You are seen, you are heard. Okay. Now, continuing on with the characteristics, the last one is the following, and that is this. We want to design learning experiences for our students that are both challenging and rigorous. And let me define rigor: increasing the complexity relative to the content. So it may not be the same in all students, and no, all means all, but we don't, but treating everyone the same is just as inequitable as treating everyone differently. So here, the whole point is, am I designing learning experiences that can build upon prior knowledge, that accelerate student learning, and do it in a way that is highly challenging? And I'm going to share with you all a story around that, because a lot of this does tie in with the following characteristic as well, and that is making real life connections between the academic content, the local neighborhood, culture, environment, and resources. So I have a cool story to share with you all on this right here. And I know Jen Hall's here, and she's heard this story before. This is one of my favorite stories to share. So let me back up. Culturally responsive educator. Remember the three principles. I validate and affirm students' cultural identities and their values. I dismantle and disrupt any power dynamics that reward a dominant group. And I empower learners, so learner empowerment. So those are the three principles. The characteristics are being socially conscious, seeing students' backgrounds as assets and not liabilities, identification of the moral imperative, getting to know students' lives beyond their name and their number, and designing learning experiences that are not only relevant, but also challenging. So what you're looking at here is a project I did at one of my previous schools that encapsulates all of what you see here. The whole theme of the project was food desert. So for those of you that are not familiar with that phrase, food desert, a food desert is a geographically identifiable area of which there is limited to no access to healthy foods, or foods that we would identify as healthy, or more specifically, what I share with the students, foods that can guarantee or give you a higher probability of longevity and good health. So there are many geographical areas, and by the way, they're not limited to the US either. I've seen them in many of the countries I've been to. These are, again, the geography of food desert. So at one of my previous schools, most of the students lived in what was identified as a food desert. So now my thinking is the following in designing the project and what we ultimately did. One, for the students, let's identify and let's come up with a definition that we can all, universally acceptable definition of what a food desert is. Now, let's do some research. So here's where it becomes multifaceted, multicurricular, and multidimensional. What is the history behind urban development? And so for me, we focused primarily on Los Angeles. But for those of you that are not in the US, I would encourage you to consider doing a historical study of the development of your urban centers in your country and ask yourself, why do the mass transportation systems, the freeways, who got to determine what neighborhoods they went through? How are businesses started? Who gets to determine what business exists in what postal codes or what zip codes? Okay. So the students did that whole thing and looked at the history here in the US around redlining, blockbusting, development of mass transportation systems, zoning laws, and all those sorts of things. So that was the first step. The next step was to identify, why is it that we don't have any healthy food stores or farmers markets in our area? Who gets to determine what those are and where they occur? Now you have that aspect. Then the health aspect. What are the long-term effects of not being able to consume fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, healthy foods in general? And then we even added the environmental justice factors of what are the long-term effects of living in areas where you're close to a factory or near a freeway, so you have more of the exhaust from the cars, less green spaces. Okay, that was another one. So that's the health aspect. When you get into the environmental justice aspect, we also got into the thing, and this is for my science teachers that might be here, is the whole idea. My question also was, why is it that on average the temperature here is 10 degrees hotter than it is going 5 miles west closer to the beach? What is the difference, and what do you see, and what do you wonder? And of course, the big thing was a lack of greenery. And so the word that is associated with that is called transpiration, which is where there is moisture that evaporates off of our greenery that creates a microclimate that keeps the temperature down. So it's not just the shade, it's also that. And so to shorten this long story, ultimately the students develop an understanding of why they live in a food desert, what is a food desert, what are the political, social, and environmental factors to doing that. What is the economic cost of it? And then now the solution was, how do we design for alleviating and essentially dismantling the fact that we live in a food desert, but do it in a way that is not only economical, but it is also accessible for us to do it right now. So that's where the students design basically little garden plots that you would put on the blocks to where you can grow fruits and vegetables. And of course, their additional research had to be what's going to grow and thrive in the environment that we have, and how do we effectively communicate this to our classmates so that everyone understands this is something that the materials are accessible for cost, the spaces are available, and here is the short, intermediate, and long-term benefits. So do you all see that whole project is not only was that culture responsive, but I can connect to almost every content area that served. And again, it's not me saying, here's what you need to do to fix your community. It's me introducing, here's something that I noticed, here's why it's important to us, and here's how it's relevant to you. And now I want to go with you through a learning process of which you can identify a real, tangible solution. And of course, the whole idea around that goes back to this slide here for you all, and that is using academic content and connecting it, in this case, to the local neighborhood, the local culture, the local environment, and the local resources that were available. And I'll share with you all, one of my big things with the students then that kind of augmented the empowerment piece was I literally said to all my students, my goal for you when you turn 18 is what? And they said, and all of them would say, well, for us to graduate from high school. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's important, but what else? And they couldn't figure it out. And I'm like, my goal is for you to register to vote. Because ultimately in their research, they found out, of course, that zoning laws and politicians can in some cases determine what gets built, where it gets built, what businesses you could have. And my whole thing is that is how you are fully empowered, in this case, as an American citizen, is to exercise your franchise by voting. And guess what? If you don't like what the elected officials are doing, especially based on the project we did, then feel free to reach out to me to support you in running for office. Because ultimately, my whole thing is this. Children can be effective problem solvers and voices for their community, regardless of their age. They should not have to wait until they become an adult to then all of a sudden have credibility with that. And that goes back to the very first thing of the empowerment. If I have the information, I've done the research, I have confirmed the research, then my voice matters just as much as the adult. And in fact, I used to say sometimes to the student, maybe you should use your voice more because clearly some of the adults, they're not using theirs or they don't get it. So therefore, you should be able to use yours as well. So that's where, again, it's looking at a learning experience that in that case was fun, engaging, all the descriptors you all use in that one project. So my question to all of you is, in the context of your students, what type of big comprehensive project might you be able to do that is cross-curricular, that is culturally affirming, that is culturally responsive, that is relevant to students, and that incorporates all those different areas of the academic content? And all of that is aligned with a learner-centered environment. I think that we hear this phrase a lot, but what really does it mean? And to me, learner-centered, it can be easily encapsulated into two distinct areas, and they are the following. How are we ensuring that that our learning environments are, and Dorothy, yeah, I have a whole story about recycling as well, but for time's sake, I can't share it. But when you think about learner-centered environments and being culturally responsive, how are we meeting the social needs of our students in that context? So the two areas are social and cognitive. I'm going to mention the social now. One is, are we modeling that? You know, for example, I would ask all of you as educators, when's the last time you admitted to your students a mistake that you made? When's the last time you confirmed or affirmed to your students that you learned something from them? And I think that modeling sends a very definitive social message that all of us are learners, and that while I might be older and might have more schooling years under my experience, it doesn't change the fact that I operate from a degree of cognitive humility, that I can learn from you, you're going to learn from me, we're going to learn from each other. And ultimately, if we learn from each other, again, it accelerates group learning. And even in terms of things like peer interaction. So remember, going back to the social aspect, how are we encouraging dialogue with peers? Dialogue that is asset-based, that is constructive, that is challenging at some time, but also ways in which you can articulate your thoughts and your ideas in an affirming way. And then continuing on, with the learner-centered is our cognitive needs. And those are things like, again, making connections to the real world, real life, and local context, supporting students in being what I call observationally literate. Like when you walk home, what are some of the challenges that you notice that we might be able to incorporate in our learning environments? And you do it in a way that is affirming, because ultimately for our students, part of them developing their young minds is being able to make literally contextual connections to the learning environment. And all of that ties in with this graphic I like to share, and that is the following. When we operate from a culturally responsive perspective, when we operate from those three principles of validating and affirming cultural identity and values, dismantling and disrupting and dismantling any dynamics that reward a dominant group, and then empowering our learners, we're going from a concept of equality where everyone gets treated the same to equity where we distribute resources based on a needs basis. We're going to the point where we're going to remove that whole fence and lead towards liberation for our learners. And liberation, to me, to go from liberation to transformation, that's where the empowerment piece comes up. Because once we become empowered as learners, we now can transform our learning environments in a context like the story I just shared with you all. You see, all students were provided the resources, support, and then again, the liberation was, here's where there's a real contextual problem or challenge that you can identify right now on a day-to-day basis. Now we together are going to come up with a real and tangible solution. And that's why I always encourage educators to be mindful of the terminology around, you need to change the world. Let's focus on our local community, because here's the thing, and I used to say this to my student, if we focus on the local community and everyone's doing that, the world's going to change. Now, what you want to do is you want to be able to say, here's what I did in my community, and how might I share that story with others to empower them to do it in their community. That's how you're going to change the world. But you start off with the local context. And all of that ties in, as I kind of conclude here, because I want to give time for some questions. All of that ties in with the 6 themes of a culturally relevant learning environment. Are we focused on the assets? Assets first, not deficits. If you were to do an inventory of the terminology that is normalized in education and identify what is asset and what is deficit based, sadly, even still to this day, the deficit list will probably be more than twice as long as the asset list. Again, affirming. I'll even share with you all a side note example of that. I used to share the story with my students that I played college football. So for those of you that are in the US, I played American football. And on the team, you weren't constantly told what you aren't good at. What you were told is, what are you good at based on your position? How do you accentuate the strengths in that? And then, of course, you do work to mitigate areas of weakness, but it was never solely from, oh, you're terrible at everything, so now we need to do this and this and this and this. Okay, so the whole thing here is focusing on the assets, and then now the next thing is the vulnerability. So you hear a lot about failure, failure, failure. Listen, I reject the use of the word failure in the context that it's currently used, because failure is identified very differently dependent upon the cultural identity and demographics of the student. For me, it's vulnerability. How am I using opportunities of mistakes or opportunities of what can be identified as failure as a learning opportunity? And then even with me as an educator, how am I being vulnerable with my students to recognize that there is room for growth for me as well? And that part of our growth and in that context is being open and honest about it in a way that is not only affirming of my experiences, but we do it from an asset and support perspective, not from a punitive perspective. And in fact, I love to ask educators, when students make a mistake, is the response punitive or supportive? Because it can only be one or the other. Ideally, we're supportive at least 99.9% of the time. And then the next one, of course, is the cultural identity, which I share with you all. How well do you know the cultural identity of your student? One of my favorite activities I used to do at the beginning of the school year with my students to begin to identify cross-cultural connections is I would literally say, we're going to do a project. You can do a video, you can do slides, you can do a story, whatever works for you. But the theme of the project is literally the following question. How does your family prepare rice? And the whole idea around that was, okay, we all consume rice, different cultures, different cultural identities, different cuisines, prepare in different ways. And then it was highlighted. These are all the cool ways that this one thing, this one grain that all of us consume is prepared. And of course, for me, it was like, I want you to highlight the beauty of how your family prepares rice, and you're going to share it with your classmates. And I want everyone to identify the similarities, the differences, and all of the, what I would say, the coolness factor of all the different ways it's done. That's just a very simple way of affirming a cultural identity, even something as simple as that. And of course, you can get into a whole lot of other things around, food is the easiest entry point, I would say, but even things that we talked about around music, the arts, stuff like that. The next one is the rigor. Again, going back to that, rigor, increasing the complexity relative to the content. So, for example, that story on food deserts, you notice how it started to get very complex, but not once did any of the students say, well, this is too hard, because it was relative to their lived experience, and we did it in a way that was scaffolded. And so that's how it became more rigorous. And in the end, I literally said to students, I want you all to assess all the different subject matters that we're focused on in this context. And by the way, I got news for you. You've done geometry, you've done algebra, you've done historical analysis, you've done writing analysis, you've done documentary style storytelling, you've done scientific analysis, you've done the scientific method. I literally did a list of all these things. And I literally asked the student, how many of you, if I were to say, we're going to do all these things in a project, you all would have looked at me like I was crazy? And of course, all the hands go up, because the whole point here again is increasing the complexity relative to the content. And again, the word I like to share with that is scaffolding. Now, the next one is engagement. You all shared that as a student experience. Remember, there's a direct correlation between engagement and investment. Am I accounting for my high engaged, my low engaged, or am I designing for multiple ways of engagement? Many of you mentioned all those different platforms that you use. Yeah. How are we designing for the student that is self-described as an introvert? What are the mechanisms for their contributions to class discussion? What are the mechanisms for the extroverts to be able to share their contribution? How are all of those different ways of contributing to our learning highlighted, accentuated, and designed for? So that's why we want to think in terms of, that's why I love that one slide you all saw with like TikTok, where it's like, look, if you want to do a video, here's a good type of video. Now, I recognize, again, some of you mentioned the whole idea around TikTok. My thing is, okay, let's take TikTok and say you can't use TikTok. What you can do is say, what are the characteristics? Video, easily designable, 60 seconds. Now, given that, what other platform could you use that you could say to the students, how many of you use TikTok? The hands go up. Perfect. I want you to use those exact same skills to design a 60-second representation of your learning, but then you're going to put it in like Flipgrid, or you're going to put it in a slide or something like that. That's how we can say, oh, here's a barrier. I'm going to work around that barrier, still with a focus on the outcome. And then the last one here I'll share with you all is the relationship. Listen, we encourage students to collaborate, but I will tell you all, students will not effectively collaborate if we don't even effectively collaborate with someone that we haven't built a relationship with. And I think when you get into the whole idea around being culturally affirming, encouraging cross-cultural connections, encouraging dialogue, encouraging students to identify their assets, that is a first step towards building relationship with students. Because I used to always tell my students, I want you to identify a classmate that you may not know right now who has a skill set that you don't have, because there's a high probability that you're going to want to work with that classmate on a project. Sometimes working with your friends is not going to produce the best project. Sometimes working with someone who has a skill set that you don't have is going to produce the best project. Again, accelerating group learning. And so with that being said, I'm going to share this quote in kind of conclusion with you all, because I really think that we have the power to empower our learners and do it in a way that is affirming. And sadly, this poem here, and I'm going to be quiet and let you all read for a moment. This poem resonates with me because I was one of those students where I was constantly told deficit-based, some things that I can't do. That is precisely why one of my barriers, even to this day, again, being vulnerable, one of my barriers right now is writing. Still, I'm working on a book, but it's not as easy. It's not as approachable or accessible for me as it should be. Let me pause for about 30 seconds. You all can read this, and then I'll do my final thoughts. And I share this with you all not for any other reason than my guess, unfortunately, is a lot of us can connect to some lived experience, some school experience, going back to that first question, that this affected us. Part of one of the most effective ways to dismantle that is to acknowledge its existence, identify how something like that might have affected us, be aware of it, and then now we work against it. That is part of that dismantle thing. So I think for us, it's really being affirming and asset-based and supportive rather than deficit-based. So with that being said, I know that the link was shared in the chat. This is a reflection document for all of you, just to serve as your own personal here's where I was. I listened to Ken's presentation. I got me thinking, here's where I want to be, and here's how I'm going to get there. So I know we can allow for a few minutes for questions, but I do want to just share my sincere gratitude to all of you for being here. I also want to thank you all for your work. I want to thank NetRef for the opportunity to share this time and space with you all. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. And hopefully I can be an added support to all of you, whether it is when I get to see any of you face to face or indirectly.
Thank you so much, Ken. I have to agree with an attendee who chatted that the time just flew by. It does not seem like we've been together for an hour, and I wish we had much more time together.
Same here.
So thank you for being here and for all of these great strategies and stories to get us thinking about how we can increase equity throughout our learning environments. We do want to get to questions, and I'm going to get to them super fast, but I do want to once again thank NetRef, who brought Ken to you today. Again, NetRef is a classroom and device management solution that helps educators keep students focused on learning when using devices and helps educators identify and support the unique learning needs of each individual student. NetRef also provides insights into your EdTech ROI, which I know is particularly important right now as you make decisions about which digital programs to continue using next year. So I know that the end of school is tantalizingly in sight, but there is still time to use NetRef this school year, and we're offering it free for the rest of the year to help you maximize these last weeks together with your students, and also to help you better understand which programs are being used most so you can plan your PD and your budget. You can learn more about NetRef at net-ref.com. You'll also see a banner at the top of the website with a link to take NetRef up on this offer to use it free through the end of the school year. It's super simple to get started. In 20 minutes, your teachers can be up and using it. So again, even though there's just a little bit of time left in the school year, there's still plenty of time to implement NetRef, and we hope you'll take them up on that offer. All right, let's go ahead and get to some questions, Ken. So how would you recommend integrating the technology that kids want to use, like TikTok and Instagram that we talked about, but not further marginalizing students who may not have access to devices, Wi-Fi, or particularly social media accounts?
Right. So, and that's a great question. And I think it's important to point out digital equity is not limited to things like it's across the board. So digital equity is devices, types of devices, access, accessibility, and then fidelity of that access. So for me, so I'll share with everyone at all but one of my previous schools, I would say at least a third, if not close to half of my students did not have, for example, internet access in the home. I would say most of them had a phone, but for me, it goes back to that culture responsive condition, characteristic I shared about socially conscious. Is it's not what I would encourage everyone is not to focus on the device or the platform, but look at the type of experience that a student may have as a result of that access. So even like I shared with the TikTok, what are the characteristics of TikTok? Again, it's visual, it's easy, it has an easy user interface, it allows for some customization, 60-second limit. Now, all of those characteristics, how can I say I can borrow those and say I'm going to use those within a context of my learning environment on a platform that I know for sure I can guarantee access to all of my students?
Yeah, and that's a great example. And I think, start small and see where you go. You
Right.
don't.
And I think it's important that also, if I may add, because a number of folks did share in the chat, and rightfully so, that we want to be mindful of student privacy, digital citizenship, all those things that we should be mindful of. Again, my main thing is it's more about the experience. Remember, go back to that first question. What is the experience a child or a student has on this platform? And how might I borrow some of those characteristics, being socially conscious, and use those within the context of my learning environment for something that I essentially can control for privacy, accessibility, things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And one of our previous webinar speakers, Dr. Monica Burns, talks about tasks before apps. And it's just what you've said, which is what is it that you want students to walk away with? What experience do you want them to have? Now let's
Right.
create that experience. And it isn't about the platform. It isn't TikTok that kids love. It's what they're doing and seeing and engaging with on TikTok. So you
Yes.
can recreate that. All right. So this individual, and I know lots of educators in schools across the country, particularly in the past year, have done this, but they've sent out some student surveys to get input on how students want to learn, particularly in a digital environment. What are suggestions for dealing with not implementing every student's idea? It seems that we alienate them more when they're asked for input and then we don't take it.
So, a couple of things. One, I would encourage everyone to be mindful of the fact that surveys is only one mechanism for feedback. Um, not all students are going to fill out a survey. Not all students may be comfortable doing a survey. Some might just want to engage in conversation. And for me to validate that, what I usually would ask students is, how might we, and I always stress the term we, design or account for accessibility, learning opportunities, and more specifically, learning representations across the board. So, in other words, it's not so much what works for me, it's what works for me, but am I considering that in context of the whole class? So, really, to answer that question, it's more a function of you're not discrediting or dismissing any student ideas, but ultimately in fact, I'll share with you all this. Here's a question I used to ask my students, like real talk. I used to say to them, look, you know what my policies are around grading. You know how you're going to do grading. Real talk. I despise a letter to represent your learning. And I said, but ultimately, I strongly believe, going back to that culture piece, I strongly believe in having a cooperative learning environment. So with that being said, how would your grade potentially change if it were based on how well you help others in class? And so then in that context, when you ask that question about how do I learn best or how can I do this, again, how is it not only helping you, but considering it's helping others? That's where the inclusion piece comes in.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think to your point about not all students take surveys, you had mentioned before, how do we get introverts versus extroverts to engage? And so asking students in lots of different ways in different contexts what will work for them, I think is an
Exactly.
important aspect too.
And even in terms of inclusion, that's why I really vehemently just reject things like class participation as a component of your grade. Like that's not inclusive. That's a non-academic factor. Or what I challenge educators, which again I did it myself, is if you're going to make class participation any part of student feedback, then how are you accounting for neurodiversity, introvert, extrovert, accessibility to devices, different ways in which communicate? You have to account for all of this then. Where to me, it's like, I want everyone participating. I'm going to do my part to ensure that if every student has a voice, every voice is heard. And if I'm missing something, please let me know.
And participation doesn't mean raising your hand and using your voice for every
That's right. That's
child.
right.
There's a lot of definitions
Right.
of participation.
I would always tell the students contributions are participation,
Yeah.
period.
Well, I'm sad to say that we're at the top of the hour and we have to say
Yeah.
goodbye. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. And thank you again, Ken, for being with us. Thank you everyone for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. And we hope that today's webinar has been helpful. Enjoy the rest of your day and best wishes for the rest of the school year. You all have done a fantastic job to date. And I know you can make it to the end.